We're so honored to have you here at the Herland Report. Research Professor Emeritus Ola Tunander. You have worked for many years at the PSYOP here in Oslo, Norway, looking at so many vital issues pertaining to geopolitics, American-Russian relations, and in the recent years also examined very carefully the wars in the Middle East and what really has been going on. And you recently came out with a book about the Libya war, how rhetoric and lies destroy the state, examining the role of the Western media, and also examining the dramatic changes within the Western media, because as you've stated as well, during the Iraq War and Vietnam War prior to that, there was a massive, protest within the Western system and within the Western population. But when it came to the Libya war, there was consensus on every level. And almost the opposite was happening on the ground as of what we were reading about in the Western media. This scares all of us.
No, I think it's really changed with the Libya war. And they were able, by presenting the war as a humanitarian action, humanitarian intervention, you were able to get support from all parts of the political spectrum. So you get support from the right wing to the left wing. There was no one in Norway that were against in the parliament. No one were against the war in the parliament. It was consensus to support a military action because it was believed that it was about protecting civilians. And everyone thought that, that you should protect civilians. And there was a kind of understanding that the international community was kind of unified entity that could go in and in an instrumental way change the situation and make it better for the people. And this was, this is very different from the Vietnam War or from the Iraq War, where you had the massive protests actually from primarily, not only, but primarily from the left wing. And now they succeeded in a way to buy the whole left wing, the Social Democratic Party and the very left wing parties, and include them in the action for a war. And this is, I think, a very new phenomenon. And maybe people have learned, because the war in Libya was catastrophic. The results were catastrophic. There is no, they believed, or many people believed, that when you took away what they called the dictator, the people would create a democracy. That didn't happen. Actually, the conflicts in Libya was very much tribal conflicts between different groups, and also, you could say, to a certain extent, religious conflicts between Islamists and other and much more moderate and secular forces.
But it's so strange to me, because when you look back to, for example, I think it is 2007, you have George Bush speaking up, and Condoleezza Rice at the time as well, stating that Muammar Gaddafi was the best example, or was a glorious example of an African leader, or a leader in the Arab world that really was so exemplary in many ways. They had fixed the Lockerbie scandal issues and paid back to the family members there. They had solved the arms race and stopped really arming up Libya to that extent. Then Gaddafi came to the UN and did some speech there and stayed in his tent and all of that. And then you go on a few years, and at the same time we saw how Mustafa Abdul Jalil, they came into 2007, the Libyan government, and started working for reforms, economic reforms, opening up the Libyan state for foreign investment, all of this. And then all of a sudden, it dips And then Gaddafi is all of a sudden the worst dictator there ever was. The funding for all his family and his family members still to this day are frozen in the banks. His wife, to this day, Sofia Farkas, can still not get her money, you know what I mean? The whole family, Aisha Gaddafi, for example, is told she is not allowed to travel anywhere. She's the daughter of a head of state that was removed in 2011, and still to this day, you know, I mean, there's so many things that to me doesn't resemble the West.
Many things, I think, indicate that it was a pre-planned operation in 2011. And the one thing you could say is when Khalil, who became Minister of Justice in 2007, he started to release prisoners. And that was considered by many as a kind of liberal move, that you should not have political prisoners. And also you have a man from Qatar who called Salabi, who was also very close to the Muslim Brotherhood, who facilitated the release. And they forced the Islamist leaders to sign a report or paper that 417 pages, I think, where it said that you should not use any violence against the regime. This was the agreement, and then it starts a military revolt, actually, largely, or a violent revolt in 2011 in connection with the so-called Arab Spring. And then Khalil immediately became the leader of the revolt and uses the people who he released the years before as his ground forces. So and the Libyan man in Qatar, the Salabi, was the one who facilitated the weapons transport. I mean, the man who had himself been able to force the Islamists to sign a paper that they should not use force, he was the one who facilitated the weapons transport to them. So it's what you see is something that some people already from 2008 or whatever was pre-planning something that could lead up to a military operation.
Yes, because it has to be quite carefully pre-planned, because when you look at several of the people involved, you have Professor Ali Tarhouni, who came from, I think it was Washington University, and the minute Libya started to, reform and they had the February 17 uprising, he moved from America straight to Libya and started working on the new central bank. I mean, it happened in just like a few weeks that the whole Libyan investment fund money, maybe we cannot say the biggest robbery in the world, but I think it kind of comes close, was removed and put into a new central bank, for example. You have again the Libyan envoy to the UN, Mr. Ibrahim Dabashi, instantly starting to talk coordinatedly at the same time, about the genocide in Libya and everything. You had Jalil then again speaking in Libya, saying that the people are being massacred, and at the same time you have this very coordinated removal of funds from Libya. So it looks to me, and when you look at the role of the Qataris as well, I mean, it's really, not to mention Hillary Clinton, it's a big web.
Very much so. No, I think it's really what happens, some people seem to have planned this from some years back. Of course, they didn't know if they would be successful, but still, they were planning. And what is interesting, if you look at Jalil, who became the leader of the National Transitional Council, and immediately from being Minister of Justice, became the leader of the revolt. He says that we will not have any agreement with the Gaddafi regime. The Gaddafi regime has to be removed, and the Gaddafi regime has to leave, and otherwise they will die. So the person who have supported him, Saif al-Islam, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, he has to leave or die, so to speak. That was Jalil's argument. While it was Saif al-Islam who had been installing him and Jibril in the government. And who come up with this recommendation for Saif al-Islam? That is a real issue, I think. And it must be someone in the intelligence community that he really trusted. And if you look for candidates, I would say it would be Mark Allen from MI6, who actually initiated the deal in 2003 and included Libya into the so-called international community and made it possible for Libya to have regular relation to other states. But that also meant that it became possible for the intelligence services to infiltrate the Libyan government. And that is what happened. It's very clear that Saif al-Islam must have understood immediately, I would say, that he was deceived. What happened? He had been the one who supported Jalil. He had been supporting Jalil's release of the prisoners. And then afterwards, he realized that everything was a setup. They were released not because he was liberal, he was actually a conservative Islamist. And they were released to become his ground forces in the revolt.
And all of this has to have been quite coordinated, because the CIA and the Americans knew very well, the British as well, that Abdullah Kimbel Haj, who was the leader of the Libyan Islamic fighting group, was a good friend, or at least acquaintance, of Osama bin Laden. They worked together in Afghanistan at the time. And we all know that the Americans were engaged in setting up the Taliban and those forces at the time in the fight against the Russians back in the day of '88. And we've all seen the pictures of Ronald Reagan with the Taliban in the White House and all of that. So it's not like they didn't know which kind of people were in those prisons in Libya. And we also know, it's common knowledge, no state, no Norwegian government or any European government can say they don't know these things. You cannot go and intervene militarily into somebody else's country without knowing what I'm about to say. So obviously they know, that's my assessment at least. We're not in kindergarten, we're not 3 years old, and state leaders know what they're doing. And for example, who was against Muammar Gaddafi the whole time? Who was fighting him? It was the Islamists. And the Islamists had their base in Benghazi. We know that for many years Benghazi was the training ground, the largest training grounds in the world to send foreign fighters to Islamists to fight in Afghanistan, for example. We know the Al-Qaeda had attempted on a number of occasions to kill Muammar Gaddafi. We know that Muammar Gaddafi, of course, Libyans would not agree if you say he's secular, they wouldn't. But to us in Europe, that means something else. Of course, he was a complete Muslim. They wouldn't agree if you say moderate Muslim either. But these are words that we have invented in our attempt to explain that he was not an Islamist. He was not a Sunni extremist, and he was fighting them. and accepted women in the army and wanted women to have an education and had a different view of the world than Yusuf Qaradawi, for example, who sat in Qatar at the time and came and did the Friday prayers on the Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring, which also nobody spoke about in the West. So when it comes to who let the prisoners out, they knew exactly which people they let out.
Yeah. No, but not in Norway, I think. But that's, I think that naivety in Norway or Sweden or these small countries, it's clear that they didn't have the intelligence service that they should have. And that would be independent of the US and the British or the French. And BBC made an interview with Prince Turki, the former intelligence chief in Saudi Arabia and then foreign minister. And they asked him that he had collaborated or cooperated closely with Osama bin Laden, and I think he brought Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan in '79. And they said, how is that possible that you collaborated with Osama bin Laden? And he said, I didn't have I had not closer relation to Osama bin Laden than the British and Americans. And then there were no questions, because they couldn't ask questions. How close were the British and American relation to Osama bin Laden? So then it was just silent. And of course the British and Americans had very close ties to Osama bin Laden. And they supported, and there is some very interesting interviews with Hillary Clinton, where she says, that we supported these people with Stinger missiles and so on in Afghanistan. And actually, the same thing happened in Libya. The same radical Islamists that the American supported in Afghanistan and later in Bosnia were supported in Libya. When one spoke in the Western media and so, most of people spoke about the rebels as some kind of democratic group of people and so on. And some people were perhaps liberal and so on, but the dominating force were the radical Islamists. And they were the only one that had military experience, because they had been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. So they were brought in, but they couldn't take orders from the British. They could not take orders from the Americans, because the British and Americans were secular. But what happened was that they introduced Qatar as a liaison state. So the special forces from Qatar were introduced in the war already from the very beginning, from the first weeks of the conflict. The Qataris appeared in Benghazi. One Norwegian journalist, for example, he was in the first days and weeks in Benghazi, and when he came down in the middle of the night to the hotel lobby, he found 50 Qatari special forces there coming in. And what did they do, So and also the British and Americans and the French special forces were there.
And it's interesting because, as you note, the Norwegian journalist was, of course, in Benghazi. He was not in Tripoli at the time, he was in Benghazi. And the Americans also and the British also confirmed they were in Benghazi. And the British, says sources, it didn't really, they landed in Benghazi thinking we have to get to know some people here because, it wasn't really that well coordinated. There was an order to engage, and it wasn't really that well coordinated, and they all landed in Benghazi. It's a little bit the same as you may see with Idlib now in Syria or other places, where you find all the Islamist groups. That's also where you find the Western journalists somehow. So the collaboration may be seen even from that angle. And when you look closely at Qatar, for example, the Qatari emir, Sheikh Al-Thani, when you go back to 1995, overthrew his own father. I mean, the Americans back then wanted to have a US base in Qatar, and the father didn't want to give that. And while he was traveling somewhere in Switzerland or in Europe, the son took power, and the first thing that happened was that the Americans got their base. And since then, Qatar has really been all open. And we all know that the Middle Easterners are very proud Muslims and a very proud people. They wouldn't listen to the Americans and the British. They've been under colonial rule. So this use of proxies, I think, has been very efficient on the British and American side.
Yes, I mean the chief of staff of the Qatari army said that we had hundreds of Qatari special forces in every region, which means that they would have at least 1,000 in all Libya. And a French journalist close to the French intelligence argued they have 5,000. I think that's too much, but still, there were quite a few Qatari special forces. And the British Chief of Defence said that without the Qataris and the Emiratis, there wouldn't be a victory in Libya. I mean, they were the most important instruments. So you had the British, American, French, and Norwegian, Danish, and so on, air power, and you had the ground forces from the Emiratis and the Qataris, and they, function as a liaison to the Libyan Islamists, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group.
To any Western audience, a Qatari may look pretty much the same as a Libyan. Like to any Eastern audience, if you see a German or you see a Greek person, looks also very much the same. So I think that the deception was successful also in the Western media due to that, because when we saw much of the same phenomenon we did when the ISIS groups and the Daesh was introduced in 2014. They all had brand new trucks, and on those trucks were a band of rebels, and they all had ragged clothes and everything. So to any Westerner, that person, we saw the same thing in Libya, very brand new trucks everywhere, but with a group of so-called bandits or whatever, rebels they call them. So the Muammar Gaddafi said at the time too that this insurgency is not from Libyans, it's coming from foreigners. There are reports from the ground in Libya state that the people that killed Muammar Gaddafi were not Libyans either, because they had a Qatari accent.
Yeah, it's maybe when the person who killed Gaddafi, according to Jibril and particularly his chief of intelligence, was a French special force guy. But there were Qataris around, as I understand. You could see on the photos that there were Qataris around because of the uniforms, but I think it's I think it was the whole approach was very sophisticated, because they knew they could not go in like they did in Iraq with forces, with US forces and so on, and with French forces. This would not be successful, and that was what Clinton's special advisor said, that this is much more clever to have Arabs doing the job. And Hillary Clinton said that this operation was a NATO Arab offensive. This is something I would like to see for the future. So the idea was that you have to have people on the ground that are not Westerners, because that does not give legitimacy. So then you have put in Qataris and Emiratis, Jordanian, and also Sudanese forces. There were quite a few Sudanese forces, according to the Sudanese President Bashir. it was not a domestic operation. It was a foreign forces that had a dominating role in this operation.
And on that note, I would just like to finalize by adding that it never was a Western value to go after head of state, to have him killed like Muammar Gaddafi, and then in the years afterwards, not allow his family, keep going after his family members, his sons, his daughters, not to allow them to have access to their own bank accounts, to refuse them to travel, and to have them on the EU list. I mean, this is not a Western value. And on that note, I wish Libya all the best, and God bless Libya. And thank you very much, sir, Professor Ola Tunander, for looking into the Libyan matters and caring about these people that live so far away from us, but that we carry the responsibility for what has happened to that nation, Libya.
Thank you.